Good morning. If you open your Bibles to Galatians 4 is where we're going to begin. So we talk about the fullness of time. Here Paul is talking about God's intentionality of timing, how he sent the Old Testament system before Jesus to really be a tutor in order to help us understand the concepts that we needed to understand about sin and sacrifice and all that, to prepare us for the sacrifice of Jesus, for Jesus to come. And here's the way that he words it in Galatians 4, verses 4 and 5. He says, "But when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons." This phrase, the fullness of time, it indicates that God was very intentional about the exact time in history that he chose to send Jesus. And it fascinates me to kind of wonder, why did he choose that particular time? I mean, why not send Jesus back in 1000 BC, which I guess it wouldn't be called BC at that point, but in 1000 BC when the golden age for the Jews under King David and King Solomon. Why not send Jesus then? Why not send Jesus in 538 BC, right after the Jews have been released from captivity to Babylon and they've returned home? Why not send Jesus then? Why not send Jesus in 2023? Certainly we can't presume to know the mind of God and all the reasons that he chose, right, to send Jesus at the particular time that he did, but I think that there are some characteristics of the first century world that I think demonstrate God's wisdom in considering that particular period the fullness of time. First of all, there was a strong Jewish expectation for the Messiah. Look with me in Luke chapter 2. In Luke 2, we learn about a prophetess named Anna who was in the temple a lot, and when Jesus as a baby was brought by his parents to the temple, she saw him. And it says in Luke 2 and verse 38, at that very moment she came up and began giving thanks to God and continued to speak of him to all those who were looking for the redemption of Jerusalem. If you look in chapter 3, in verse 15, when John the Baptist is on the scene, there's just a lot of excitement that things are changing. It seems like this is the time when the Messiah is going to come. And so it says in verse 15 of Luke 3 that the people were in a state of expectation. And all were wondering in their hearts about John as to whether he was the Christ. Now, part of the reason for this expectation among the Jews was the Old Testament prophecy. Like Daniel, for instance, who said that the Messiah would be sent during the time of the Roman Empire. So there's already this expectation. We're under the Roman power. Surely God is going to act. But that still kind of leaves us with the question, why though? Like, why would God have his prophets prophesy that Jesus would come in the Roman Empire time? Why that particular period? Well, when you study the history leading up to the Roman Empire, the Jews were just getting absolutely pummeled by the Greeks. The Greeks were trying to spread their culture and religion across the world through Alexander the Great. And so they were trying to force the Jews to adopt their religion. And when many of the Jews rebelled against that, they were heavily persecuted for decades and just beaten down and feeling like the Greeks are just dominating us. And gratefully, the Jews they were able to kind of fight back and lead this whole Maccabean revolt and rebellion, and they overthrew the power of the Greeks. And so they were free, and everything was great for like 80 years. And then the Romans came in and took all their freedom away again. Put them back into bondage. I mean, look at the history of the Jews. I mean, they're just constantly in bondage to some foreign nation. They finally get a little bit of freedom, and then the Romans come in and take away their freedom again. And so the Jews, they're just completely disheartened politically at this time. I mean, they are longing for this promised king from the Old Testament to come and give them everlasting freedom. The Jews, I think, had reached the point of exasperation because they realized they couldn't save themselves by their own efforts. They had been there. They had tried that. They had led their own rebellions, and it just led to a dead end every time. They needed God's king. Their king right now is Herod, who was an evil maniac, basically a puppet to do Rome's bidding. The priesthood was in shambles, and religion had been reduced to a set of empty rules, spearheaded by arrogant, self-righteous elitists. So the Jews, again, were desperately waiting for a righteous king like David to come and set everything right again. Secondly, Pax Romana. This means Roman peace. It refers to a 200-year period of time starting just 30 years before Jesus came. It was a golden age where Rome's military force created peace in the world through law and order. Before that time, the world was a place of anarchy and, survival of the fittest and every man for themselves. Many people at the time actually regarded Pax Romana as a miracle. That you could actually have some semblance of peace on such a worldwide scale. And part of the way that Rome maintained that peace was through their elaborate and intricate road system that allowed their military legions to travel to different parts of the empire and to squash anybody who disrupted the peace of Rome. Well, all of this created a world where it was easier for Jesus and his disciples to travel to different places. Though, compared to his apostles later in the book of Acts, Jesus didn't really travel super far. But it still allowed them to travel places without being endangered in every single place that they went. And of course, especially after Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, it allowed his apostles to fulfill the Great Commission to go into the world to bring the gospel to all nations and even to the remotest parts of the earth. Thirdly, there was a shared language. Before the Romans, the Greeks did manage to Hellenize the world and spread their culture everywhere, which means everybody throughout the Roman Empire spoke a common language, Koine Greek. Now, it is true, people knew other languages. Romans spoke Latin and Jews knew Hebrew and Aramaic, but Koine Greek was a common language shared by everyone so that they could all understand together the teachings of Jesus, whether spoken or later written down in the New Testament, which was written in Koine Greek. Fourthly, it was a world that valued power above all. The Roman Empire worshipped power. It's how they maintained peace in the world. The empire functioned on the thought that peace is only possible through military might and force of power against your enemies. In one of Daniel's prophecies, hundreds of years before the Roman Empire, in Daniel 11:38, he says that Romans would worship the God of fortresses. And this was the perfect timing for God to send Jesus to teach the world that real peace is not gained through military domination, but through humble submission to God. Jesus came to flip human power on its head, a power that crushes their enemies by force, and to show us the real power from God that loves one's enemies to the point of death on a cross. I wonder if this is part of what Jesus meant in John 14:27 when he told his disciples, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you." I think there's part of that where it's like, okay, it's a better peace than the world because it's everlasting and all that. But I wonder if part of it is the peace Jesus gives is different from the world's peace. Because the world thinks the way to peace is to crush all of your enemies, to crush everybody that takes away your peace. And Jesus is saying, no, I'm going to give you a different kind of peace, a peace that actually loves your enemies and is willing to lay down your life for your enemies. That's the real peace. And finally, crucifixion. Crucifixion was originally invented by the Persians, but it was modified by the Romans to make it even more torturous. And crucifixion was not just about the physical pain that you would endure, but also the emotional pain of the social stigma surrounding it by both the Jews and the Romans. Here's a quote from a commentary by Kenneth Chumbley. It says, "Crucifixion was the most degrading form of capital punishment, reserved for rebels, mutinous slaves, and other unspeakable enemies of society. It was also the most prolonged and painful. Cicero, a Roman statesman and philosopher, described crucifixion as, quote, a most cruel and disgusting punishment. He said to bind a Roman citizen is a crime. To flog him is an abomination. To kill him is almost an act of murder. To crucify him is what? There is no fitting word that can possibly describe so horrible a deed. He continues, what's more, the Jewish revulsion of crucifixion, was heightened by the fact that the law of Moses placed a curse on anyone hanging on a tree. To be crucified indicated repudiation by everyone, including God. Now, if Jesus were to have come in the year 2023, and not in the first century world, he wouldn't have even received the death penalty, most likely. First of all, because most would have just smiled at Jesus' teachings and said, oh, well, you have your truth and I have mine. And, oh, you identify as the Son of God? Well, that's nice. Secondly, half of the U.S. doesn't support the death penalty. And third, even if he was put to death in 2023, it would just be lethal injection behind closed doors. It was perfect timing for Jesus to come during the time of crucifixion, because it was the perfect way to display to the world the depth of God's love for us, while also simultaneously showing us the horror of our sin. I mean, if you think about it, technically all the payment for sin required was death, Jesus' death. You know, the wages of sin is death. So all we really needed was Jesus to die for us. So it shouldn't really have mattered how he died. It would have been sacrificial enough if Jesus were willing to take a lethal injection for us. But we all know it would be nowhere near as sacrificial as going to a cross for us. And therefore, it was because Jesus came in the fullness of time that he was able to accomplish the most possible good in the world. Jesus surely could have accomplished good in any generation, right? In any time, Jesus could have accomplished good. But God chose that time because the stage was set to allow Jesus to accomplish the highest possible good in the world. There's a discouraging thought today that parents sometimes hear. And that is, I certainly wouldn't want to bring kids into the world that we're living in today. I mean, look how evil it is. But couldn't God have said the exact same thing about the first century world? I'm not sending Jesus into that world. They have crucifixion there. And yeah, there's some positive things like a Jewish expectation and there's a patrimony, but the problem is the Jews, they are excited about the Messiah, but their expectation is totally false and it's going to lead them to kill my son. And the patrimony is great, but all that means is the Jews are just going to have to bring my son to the Romans and the Romans will have to kill him. So that means, he won't be stoned to death like the Jews would. He's going to be crucified. I'm not sending Jesus into that world. But what God shows us in Jesus is that as evil and dangerous as that world was for his son, it was actually the perfect timing for him to be born so that he could accomplish the greatest amount of good. Amen. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, God has made everything appropriate in its time. When he called the prophet Jeremiah, God said, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I have appointed you a prophet to the nations. God brought Jeremiah into a terribly wicked world. But according to God, it was the exact time he needed to be there as a prophet. When Esther was in a position to save her people as queen of Persia, Malachi says to her, who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this? And in Acts 13, in one of Paul's sermons, he said about David that David served the purpose of God in his own generation. If you're wondering, as a married couple, are we really doing the right thing bringing kids into this evil world? God shows us in Jesus. And he shows us in so many of his other righteous servants over the years that he used for his purposes that yes, the world is evil. And yes, your kids are going to face hardship because of it. But Jesus shows us God may be allowing our children to be born in the fullness of time. Amen. At just the right moment, at just the right generation, for them to accomplish the greatest amount of good. Jesus gives us hope that no matter how evil this world is, God is in control. And if we trust and serve him like Jesus did in the fullness of time, he can use us to change the world for good. in ways we never thought possible, and in a generation we never thought was possible to change. Jesus came in the fullness of time.